Good morning and welcome to Positively Politics, the show where we break down the sometimes complicated and negative world of politics in a straightforward and academically rooted way. My name is Dr. Merrifield Wilson. I'm an associate professor of political science here at the University of Indianapolis, as well as the host of this show. And if you haven't caught Positively Politics before, or if it has been a while, this show is all about asking questions, inciting conversations, bringing in new ideas and perspectives to help make light of what I like to call the political minutia of the world. And this week is a great example for this because we are nearing the end of the legislative session and there's so much going on in the state house. Of course, there's a lot of things nationally in terms of politics too but this is exactly why I love the opportunity in this show and what I hope that you get out of each episode, each week and each topic, because there's so much going on that's hard to make sense of it. So I'm going to focus today on a particular point of interest for me in legislation, because it's been a long-standing topic. It's been much like those Sunday alcohol sales. For a long time, it was discussed, but never actually changed. And unexpectedly, I have to say, this might be the session where that happens. Now, I'm talking about abolishing or merging, but essentially streamlining the township system in Indiana. And this is something that has been discussed really for decades, but I want to get to first what townships do, how they're different from other forms of local government, and then talk about two of the pieces of legislation that have essentially at this point become merged. And that's Senate Bill 270, which is the predominant focus that we'll talk about, but then also HB 1315 and two different approaches to streamlining or making more efficient the township model. And then we'll talk about what that might look like and what that looks like in the context of other things going on with regards to our state and local government, right? The concept of home rule, which I think we could say very effectively Indiana has very little of, but also what we call this real state intervention, right? The state oversight into local government in ways that we saw last year with Senate Bill and now Senate Enrolled Act 1 with regards to property taxes. And then this year with what will likely, it seems, happen before the end of session next week in terms of townships. So you're listening here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson as we're talking today about two bills that address what they see as a duplication of government efforts and cost in terms of the township model of government in Indiana. So let's step back for a second, procedurally, right? What townships are, what they do. Because not every state has township government, but historically, they served an important purpose when our country and our state was far more rural. So you would have in a county, very small cities, if that, right? Small municipalities, villages, towns, etc. And you would largely be served with a township in terms of your immediate government needs. Now, counties and cities are different in a couple key ways and things that probably naturally make sense to you, but I teach this as part of a course because I think we just assume they're different. We don't really focus on how. We think of counties as the administrative arm of the state government. So counties provide all of these state functions at a local level with the understanding that even though I personally live in Marion County and it is just as easy for me to get to the state house as it is to downtown, the city county building, right? That's not true for all residents. And for most people, basically everybody else, it would be easier to go to your county government, whichever place has the county seat, easier to go there and be served by that level of local government than to go through the state. So when we think of this as an administrative arm, right, the counties provide the basic functions that state government does, but local and closer to you. I had a good friend that once would describe this as the licenses you get when you're hatched, you're matched, and you're dispatched. And I will never forget that. I will always use that. I want to cite, this was Nancy Sparks who used to say this. And it's true because when you're hatched, you get a certificate. It's your birth certificate, right? You're matched, you're married, you get a marriage certificate. That also comes from the county. And then when you are dispatched, when you pass away, you get a death certificate. So these are examples of things that come from state government, but they are served through counties. So they serve as the administrative arm. In in most ways, what the county does not differ from county to county. Now, there are exceptions, and Marion County is one of them because we have consolidated government with the city and the county with Unigov. But for the most part, county government is separate from city. And city, when we think of municipalities, right, they're granted a charter, and that charter comes from state government. It's not the same as a state constitution because there's less autonomy from the city. The city gets whatever the state will give them and allow them. And the phrase we often like to use in political science to describe city government is that cities can be created or destroyed by the state. And that's actually true for counties as well. One of my favorite things to look at are old state maps where you can see in Ohio, for example, started with a handful of counties, right? And then as the population grows and shifts, you divide up into smaller and smaller counties. I love seeing how they carve out of one and add to another, create additional counties. Right? But the state does have the authority to create or destroy. And that's true with counties, but also true with cities. Cities provide more functions because they are a recognition of the people, the population living there. So cities can provide things like sidewalks and libraries and parks. You can have county parks too, of course. But the cities are able to offer more infrastructure and things that we would say are necessary in a place that has more dense population. I want to add one more thing before we talk about the township merger that I'm building up to here that our state legislature is considering right now at the end of their session. And that is with regards to the cities versus the counties and the services and functions they provide. In Indiana, we have classifications of cities, right? We have a first-class city. That's us here if you reside in Indianapolis. And then we go down in classifications based on population. And there are a lot of states that do that. Alabama does that, for example. Wyoming does that. But there are also states where their state constitution does not recognize a difference in terms of population or the way they're taxed or the services are provided on the basis of name. And North Carolina is my favorite example of this because over the winter, just 2 months ago, my family and I did a little road trip, drove through North Carolina, through Charlotte, and then a bunch of other very beautiful, very small little areas. And they could be called, much like Charlotte, the city of Charlotte, the village of Charlotte, the town of Charlotte, the hamlet, you could call it whatever, right? In North Carolina, in their state constitution, they do not care what you call it. They do not make a distinction based on population or taxes. Now, let's get back to the issue at hand. I just described the difference between city and county government. And if you just tuned in, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, here for Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. We're talking about two bills that have essentially merged. I think the predominant train of thought comes through SB 270, but also talking about the ideas in HB 1315. And this is the change in the number of townships Indiana will have to serve local residents. Now, I mentioned earlier, but I was talking about different types of government, right? Not every state has a township level. And in modern era, townships provide really minimal services. The thing I think is probably most important, they provide emergency services and in particular emergency funds. So if you're going to be short on a utility payment, right, and you can't make a rent bill, right, you can petition, you can reach out to the township. And there are places where we would say that might be more important, that might be more necessary than in others. And I think that's what you see in Senate Bill 270 and House Bill 1315. So it looks like 270 is the one that's the predominant thought. I want to explain the two differences here. Both would essentially dissolve or merge townships, but they're looking at it from two different lenses. House Bill 1315 was saying if you have a township that's primarily covered by a city, that you could just get rid of the township in a sense and utilize city resources. And I'll tell you, in Marion County and Indianapolis, you also have 9 townships. They're talking about several layers of government, even though we do have unified government that merges in most cases the city and the county. We have those 4 excluded municipalities in Marion County. So I'm talking about Speedway, Beech Grove, Southport, and Lawrence. But outside of those excluded municipalities, you are in Marion County, you are in Indianapolis, and those two things are merged. Now, Alana Schonkweiler is a Republican from Noblesville. She was the author of HB 1315 and was looking at these townships saying, if you are already a part of a city, the township government is redundant and unnecessary. I want to focus, though, on Senate Bill 270. Now, this one's authored by Rick Niemeyer, James Buck, and Greg Walker. And what it would do is create a performance metric, essentially, and give out points to consider whether or not a township is performing to its fullest capabilities, right? Whether or not it's really necessary for people, right? And whether or not it may be redundant, it may not be utilized, it may not be necessary. That's the argument under Senate Bill 270. And so this would essentially merge townships that weren't seeing as being as efficient and as effective and as necessary. And when you're looking at this bill, this originated, of course, in the Senate. That's why it's called SB 270. It has since gone on to the House. And Schonkweiler, who I mentioned, I cited her, she authored HB 1315. Well, she's been added as a co-sponsor just earlier this week on Senate Bill 270. It's already had its first reading in local government. It was then reported to Ways and Means, but looks likely within the next week that we have, when we expect the state legislature will adjourn after next week, likely to pose to pass. Now, you're listening here to WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, here for Positively Politics and talking about the township mergers, dissolution, right? Getting rid of the township governments. But I think one of the things that's really important to consider in Indiana with these township bills is that there is a general consensus that maybe the townships are necessary. That is not, however, how everyone sees it. And there is an organization, it's Indiana Township Association, right, that's resistant to just getting rid of townships as a whole. They've actually favored Niemeyer's approach. That's the Senate Bill 270 that we just discussed, basically creating a point system to evaluate how the township functions and whether or not it's still necessary. It would merge, of course, those townships that it sees as not being needed. This is different from HB 1315 that was more or less going to look at population, geography, and budget, right? If you overlap there with a city and say, well, we don't need to have a separate township for this. But one of the things that's interesting with the townships is the question of how much redundancy, how much duplication of effort do they provide, and what unique services do they offer that would not be as effective or efficient if utilizing, let's say, county government, right? Or city government. In rural areas, this is especially interesting because you do see that service, that function of a township government, I think, operating very differently than in an urban space. But in either location, arguably, I might say in an urban area, I am surprised, having moved to Indiana, how important township geography is in recognition to folks. And in Indianapolis and Marion County, where you can say you're from here and so are literally a million other people, I find people oftentimes cite, so which township do you live in? Which school district do your children go to? Where are you from in the city? And how helpful that geographic indicator is. Now, when the townships were initially created, again, it was at a time where government looked vastly different. You didn't have the same level of services, the same level of interaction, but also you're talking about a time when it was harder for people to travel, right? It was just slower. Right? It felt like you had to, going less far took longer. I truly can't imagine. I think about this all the time, especially in the cold winter months. I think I would just become a homebody, probably October through March in Indiana. Sometimes April, it can be really cold in April too. But the townships provided that opportunity, and they certainly still provide that in some cases. So I wanted to mention that because I think it's helpful to understand that while there's a lot of conversation about how necessary are townships, there's a recognition that they do serve an important role in some circumstances. right? And the real key issue here is looking for efficiency. So one of the things I think is interesting about SB 270 or HB 1315, or just in general, the argument for the elimination of townships is that those who both support the townships and want to see them dissolved, eliminated, merged, however one wants to describe it, right? Fill in your verb of choice there, is that both sides agree, right? Government efficiency is important, but what's the cost? And that is going to be the question in terms of services, right? A lot of township officials cite the need for the services that they offer, right? And what they do and what they provide, and how it would be, if not impossible, but certainly difficult, it'd be less effective and efficient if those services were offered from other people. Right? One of the things I want to talk about specifically in the bill is the discussion in terms of points, because I think this is very interesting. And I love the creation of an objective measure to try to understand and evaluate something that oftentimes might feel a little subjective. So we're going to talk about that next. I just want to remind you, you're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. Now, I want to talk about the measurement, basically how you would create this point system, because I think this is important in the legislation, but also a very fair point of interest if we're saying we're going to eliminate ineffective or unnecessary townships, and we'll use a point process for this. Now, I can really appreciate, again, this aim for an objective measurement that's focused on the value, right? So the output, the experience, right? But is also trying to do it in what feels like an unbiased or neutral way. So you say, okay, well, based on these qualifications, we'd say, yes, township is necessary, or no, perhaps that it's not. And so the bill actually includes these details that are really interesting, and talks about the way townships will accumulate points. And it would be much like a basketball or football game, right? The more points, the better justification to say that you would need to exist. So some townships provide emergency aid, right? Not all of them necessarily are going to do so. Some are responsible for operating the fire departments and emergency medical services and those agencies. So some of the townships provide that as part of their government function. Right? There were other things that feel a little bit more punitive, maybe, but are important as well. And they talk about filing financial reports when they're due on a timely manner. And then if they've had candidates in recent elections. And I think this one's interesting in terms of the qualification of candidates, right? So you would get more points, ostensibly, if you have had candidates in recent elections. And one of the things this probably indicates, this is what I'm guessing on the basis of this in the point system, is that people see this as a value position. They see the function and the responsibility of the township government being valuable, right? And so having candidates for these positions reinforces that. I think another thing you could add to this, though it's not specifically in there in terms of the point system that's outlined in Senate Bill 270 that we're talking about right now, right, could be how many candidates, right, or the competitiveness of candidates. I want to deviate for just a second and say we're going to be talking about elections very soon, because it is an election year, and we had the filing deadline just over 2 weeks ago, and we're looking at incredibly exciting races for the General Assembly that you don't always see. That's not to say that they're going to be competitive, but at least in terms of partisan competition, Democrats have a candidate up in all the 25 Senate seats and in 91, I believe, of the 100 House seats. And you're looking at some interesting primary races, because President Trump had said after redistricting, he was going to find candidates to compete against those state senators in particular who opposed the redistricting process and voted as such. Whether or not those candidates are competitive and whether or not they win is a different story. But to that point, we will talk about that in a bit too. So the competitiveness in terms of the races is also one of those fundamental features. It's a part of the accumulation of points that townships will be able to achieve to be able to point to their need and their importance, right? Their value in local government. Now, we have heard often from townships, and I mentioned earlier the Indiana Township Association, that they do provide important services and functions to local government. And one of the things that they will argue, as many municipalities right now in Indiana would, is that they are subject to state changes that limit what they're able to do, even though what they do is provide an invaluable service. And I want to tie this in to Senate Enrolled Act number 1 that we saw take effect last year, because this was the property tax bill. It was the big focus, that and the budget, because it was a budgeting year, right? But it was the big focus of the state legislative session last year. And you saw local governments far and wide, Republican and Democrat, big and small, right, really lobby against this effort, because what Senate Enrolled Act did was significantly curb the amount of property tax these municipalities were able to collect, meaning fewer taxes, fewer services, right? And from the local municipalities' perspective, this is unfair. It's not something that they chose or even necessarily that their voters did, though this lowers the property taxes that voters, homeowners, right, property owners had seen increase at incredible rates. And there had been a large outcry, much like we talked about utilities earlier this season, but a large outcry, like this is unfair. Our property taxes have increased so much. And so you have that kind of tension there. But I think you also see that here with regards to townships. It's the question of local preeminence and how much does the state take over in terms of what local government does. Now, there will be townships. We're going to talk a little bit about a report that came out 2-3 years ago from the Indiana Township Associations, but townships have pushed back against this concept of merging or dissolving, much like you saw local government push back against the property tax cuts that were going to impact the funding they had for services and functions. And I think you expect that on a certain level, but I also want to remind you that through the state constitutions, local government exists, and states can create or destroy local government. It's not a relationship built on reciprocity. It's not something where local governments have much control or say. It's very different than federalism, right? When we're thinking in terms of our state and our federal government, and they have different levels of power. You have reserved and delegated or enumerated powers. They're outlined in the Constitution, even if the 10th Amendment doesn't specify exactly what state gets to do, right? States have authority through the 10th Amendment. That is not like that in the relationship between state and local government. Local governments exist on the whims of state. And thus you see, this state dominance, the state influence in local governments that might to some seem unfair, even though states have the legal authority, right? The constitutional right, if you will, to be able to do just that. Now, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. You're listening here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. We're talking today about township government, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the argument for townships and what we see as being really important. There's 20 states in the country that utilize townships, and they're actually very specific in terms of areas. So you're talking about basically New England and Mid-Atlantic and then Midwest. As far west as South Dakota, right? And as far south, you might say, as Missouri. But they're really focused. If you're looking at your map of the United States, when we say 20 states have this, we're looking at the North and the East. Now, again, going into the Midwest and some of the Mid-Atlantic, but it's really concentrated in a particular area. And I find that to be interesting because then we can talk about what the townships do and how they operate. And a lot of times they serve as that sub-unit of government below the county government that works and serves in very specific ways for local needs and interests. And so when we look at that with regards to what the townships do and the fact that some states have them and some states don't, I have to ask as a political scientist, I'm like, okay, so what about the states that don't have them? Well, those responsibilities are subsumed, right? Or they just naturally belongs. They don't have townships to city or county level governments. And that's the alternative in this case. If we got rid of townships altogether, and I want to be clear, that is not what HB 1315 nor what Senate Bill 270, it's likely the one that goes forward, right? That's not what either of these is arguing, but it would eliminate some townships. And if we did that, right, we either would, in terms of merging townships, provide the same services, but through both right? If you're combining 2 or 3 through 3 different townships, or you provide that service at a larger, one would say, a county level. And that is what we see in the 30 states in the United States that don't actually have a township system. Now, I want to mention this too, because I've talked a lot about some of the arguments in favor of these pieces of legislation. But as I said, the Indiana Township Association, for example, favors townships and really tries to make an argument for why they're necessary. They published a report, came out 3 years ago, essentially talking about the value of these townships and one of the things that they can do. And one of the things in the report that that's highlighted is that they serve as, they call it local protectors, right? Aid and assistance to local government in a way that you don't see at the county level. I talked about the utility and housing aid. So if you're unable to pay a bill, and we're not talking about like a car payment, right? But you can't make rent. You're not able to pay for your electricity bill. And we did talk about utilities earlier in this session, right? That's also a big issue for this particular legislative session. But I found this to be really interesting. So in the report that came from the Indiana Township Association, they said that in Indiana, right, the 1,002 townships dole out an estimated $20 million in aid through townships annually, right? Plus money that they get from higher level government, so whether it be county or state. So that's $20 million through townships. And I think it's also important to add too, if you're in Marion County, you got 9, but there are 1,002 townships across the state. So whether some are dissolved or merged together, that particular number could change, right? And one of the things that's interesting in this report is they talk about the role of making sure you're helping individuals, that providing funding temporary aid and assistance to low-income residents in this particular way really isn't done at any other level in the same type, in the same way, right? And that can be really important. Townships, of course, are close to local government, and the report also talks about that. The fact that being close to local government, it's accessible, right? You know where the township center is. It's easy to find, easy to presumably get to, but that close to the people, close to local government concept matters a lot. A lot of times it makes it more easier to identify, but easier to access, right? More accessible for individuals when you make it smaller on the local level. And that's exactly what Indiana's 1,002 townships are able to provide. And as we look forward into this legislative session, in just 1 week left, it looks likely that Senate Bill 270, which would provide these measurements, the point system, if you will, to determine which townships would merge and which would stay, that as this passes forward, this in fact might be the legislative session in which townships are reevaluated, in which townships do change form, right? Not necessarily changing function, but looking in terms of what counts as a township, what constitutes the township, and what's necessary in the township. And I think this is a really good example of legislative attrition for those that felt townships were a duplication of effort or redundancy in government. Because that thought, that argument, has percolated for 2 decades, as far as I'm aware of, in Indiana government. And yet there really hadn't been effective movement till this session. As I mentioned, the Sunday alcohol sales, I think a lot of times I speak to people and they say, oh, this is never going to change. Things aren't going to change. The state legislature always does this or always does that. And I think this is another good example to remind us that legislative attrition matters and that things, in fact, do change. And sometimes it's the calculus, it's the strategy, it's the partnership, it's who's opposed and support and what's at stake. Right? And sometimes it's something else entirely. But it reminds us that the politics does evolve and change, and it's responsive in as much as it can be proactive in certain circumstances. And I think that's exactly what you see here in terms of House Bill 1315, but especially Senate Bill 270, which is poised to pass and become a Senate Enrolled Act, likely effective July 1st here in Indiana. I want to thank you for tuning in today and remind you, you can catch Positively Politics here on WICR every Saturday morning at 11:30. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson for WICR 88.7 The Diamond. This has been Positively Politics.